So I'm going to do a bunch of stuff with some oscillators, and the basic concept is, how do you take a couple of waveforms, they could be from the same oscillator or from different oscillators, and combine them in ways to create interesting new waveforms? How do you splice them or blend them together? And what started me down this path was a presentation by John Sonnenberg at NopCon a couple years ago called Wave Replacement Synthesis, where he built a patch on his 5U system to replace a part of the waveform of one oscillator with the waveform of another oscillator. And I've been kind of running with that idea, and a few manufacturers have too. There's several oscillators dedicated to working this way. But I wanted to just kind of like run through the gamut of possibilities, including a way I haven't seen any manufacturer do it yet, which I think opens up some new ways of going. So the concept is you're going to start with two waveforms and combine them somehow to make a third waveform. So you need two more things to do this. A way of combining those two waves together. A lot of oscillators just use a switcher to switch between them, but I think a crossfader module is a far better approach, and I'll show that. And then the second thing that's kind of fun is who's controlling the switching. Now, who's deciding when to switch between the two waveforms? And the point of John Sonnenberg's presentation was, let's use another oscillator waveform to switch between them. So it's audio rate switching between parts of two different waveforms to mix them together. So I'm going to be exploring that range of possibilities. What can you do by mixing together two waveforms by using a third waveform? And I'll start simple and get more complicated as time goes on. So I'll switch over to the system. I'm going to be doing a lot of stuff with just one oscillator, the Spectrum, but I'll be bringing in other oscillators like the Moog and the Disting and the Erica Wavetable later on. I'm happen to be using a Happy Nerding dual crossfade to be my crossfader. Virtually any VCA-based crossfader will work fine. I had a little bit of an issue trying to use Warps, which is a digital crossfader. It didn't sample the inputs fast enough. But anyway, that's getting off into trivia. So the basic thing is you have an A waveform and a B waveform. And I'm color coding them throughout to be green for the A waveform. I'll just plug in a sine wave here. And then blue for the B waveform, something like a sawtooth wave in this case. And then on my scope, the output is the yellow waveform. That's the composite of the two. And by just putting them into a crossfader to begin with the crossfade at the center position, it just mixes the two together. I can go to sine on one end or sawtooth on the other end, depending on how I have the crossfade set up. And you can play with that manually. Or you can go ahead and get some automatic modulation like from an LFO to do the crossfade for you. Let's go ahead and patch into that. So I just have the LFO on the Mini Moog crossfading between the two waveforms. As we start to get into audio rates for the LFO, you start getting some interesting harmonics now. So what's fun is instead of using something like an LFO to do the crossfade, let's go ahead and choose another waveform out of our oscillator, like a square wave. And what a square wave is going to do then is just say, while the square wave's high, let the one wave get through, and when it's low, let the other waveform get through. As I vary the pulse width modulation, I'm going to decide which waveform we should use more of. More of the sine wave coming through, or more of the sawtooth coming through. So when you mix together two waveforms by switching between them instead of just mixing them together, you get the harmonics of both of them, but then you get some additional harmonics from whoever's doing the switching. And then whenever there's a discontinuity, as we jump, for example, from the sawtooth wave to the sine wave, there's a sudden jump in level here. You're going to get a lot of really bright harmonics whenever you get a sudden impulse like that. So when they're the same level, there's very little buzziness, but the more difference there are between the waveforms, the buzzier it gets. So you can either tune in a brand new waveform just by dialing that, but then it becomes fun to modulate it. So I'll go ahead and pull my LFO again and patch that to the pulse width modulation. No depth. A lot of depth. So you get something that's kind of a pulse width modulation sort of sound going in between the two different wave shapes. Kind of cross between that and sync. So you can use an LFO or you can envelope it if you want to. Take the output of an envelope generator and say, let's pull our pulse width over to just a sine wave. So we start with just a sine wave, then have the envelope open up the window and allow more of the sawtooth through. Increase my depth here. Let's get this correct. There we go, in this output. Or slow attack, slow decay. So that's the most basic way of splicing together multiple waveforms. And there's a few oscillators that do this basic trick. There's the Dove WTF window transform function oscillator that opens up a window through one waveform to reveal a second waveform. There's the Future Sound Systems recombination engine, which does this. Probably the most crazy one is the Wave Razor, which can actually do splices between 8 different waveforms. But it can be a static sound unless you're modulating it. So it gets more fun when you get away from using just one oscillator and instead start bringing in multiple oscillators that are detuned from each other and start getting some traveling between the waveforms. For example, instead of using the sawtooth from the spectrum, I'm going to grab the sawtooth from the Mother 32, the VCO here, which is slightly detuned. So as it's traveling through the window of that transition in the sawtooth being played or not played, you get different harmonics brought in. But since you're using another oscillator, it doesn't have to just be detuned. You can go ahead and choose different tunings, different intervals, like fifths, fourths, thirds, seconds if you want to get really inharmonic. Go up an octave. Or it's really fun when you start going up multiple octaves. Now you really get some craziness as you open and close the window and you switch between the two different waveforms. Waveform A, the sine wave. Waveform B, the mother tuned up a few octaves. Or we'll go ahead and LFO between those. I was using the envelope generator. Let's go ahead instead to get triangle out of the mother. So you start getting some real craziness when you mix things that way. And of course you can go down to sub-octave as well. And there it's one octave up. So you can play around with having different oscillators that you're splicing between, or you can pull in another oscillator to actually do the splice and let that be detuned. So I'm going to go back to just using the spectrums, sine tooth, and saw wave as our donor waveforms. And instead of taking a square wave out of the spectrum to be the splicer, I'm going to take it out of the disting because it may be detuned a little bit. Whoops. Auxiliary in. So again, the red is the output of the disting, which is driving the crossfader to go between the green wave and the blue waveform, the A and B inputs, and the yellow is the output. And since it's another oscillator, you can go ahead and tune it to different octaves, things like that. And when you start enveloping it, you can start having some fun. There's a bit more motion to it than a lot of simple just two oscillator patches. So you're getting harmonics from the two donor waveforms, in this case the sine and the sawtooth, but also harmonics from the tuning of the splicer waveform, and then additional harmonics whenever there's a discontinuity between them. I can go ahead and go down to a sub-octave on this, so it's just basically alternating between a sawtooth and a sine wave. So that's the way a lot of the current wave splicing oscillators work, is particularly in the case of like the Future Sound Systems recombination engine and the Wave Razor. They allow you to detune all the component oscillators from each other to create all this interesting beating. But rather than switching, I started saying, what if we took advantage of having a crossfader and instead of just switched between waveforms, we crossfaded between waveforms at audio rate? So in this case, the disting has a triangle or a sawtooth wave that can be its output. So rather than getting this harsh square wave transition, we get a more gentle triangle wave transition. It's not quite as buzzy. And that's my issue really with the square wave all the time, is that it gets kind of overloading with high harmonics, nothing but buzziness. But when you use a different waveform to crossfade between your donor waves, then you're starting to get something smoother. Now fortunately, the disting also has the ability to voltage control the wave shape between a sawtooth and a triangle wave. So I can plug into the Y input and actually change the shape of the waveform that's crossfading in between the other waveforms. Now we're getting a sound with a lot of motion. Using two oscillators rather than just having them detuned from each other, the harmonic content's actually switching between things. And this is just using like your normal analog type waveforms. You can of course start to bring in things like wavetable oscillators as either the donor or the switcher and get a lot more complex here. So let's go ahead and, shall we keep this complex or simple? Let's start simple, then we'll get crazy with it. I'll go ahead and go back to just the square wave out of the spectrum to switch between the waveforms. But instead of the sawtooth wave out of the spectrum, I'm going to go ahead and take the wave shape, the wavetable out of the Erica. As I sweep through the different waveforms, we'll start getting some different sounds. Whoops. Ha. Who just patched an output to an output? Pretty funny, I think. as I change the wave shape, one of the donor waveforms is going to change in shape. And I can change the pulse width that combines them together. Then bring in something like my LFO to change that splicing wave shape. Then change the wave shape as well. That starts getting pretty complex pretty quickly, and I can either use the Erica as one of the donor waveforms that has a sub-octave output as well. Or I can use the Erica, the Wavetable oscillator, to be the source of our crossfade in between our waveforms. I'll go ahead and put the LFO instead into its wave shape. There we go, wave CV. So it's using a wavetable sound to crossfade between just a sine wave and a sawtooth wave. But you can hear how the harmonics, in this case, which are vocal oriented, really impress upon the final mix. And again, there's sub-octave outs from the Erica, so I can go ahead and slow down how fast we're switching in between. Bring in a little bit of filter. Now it starts to become a real drone monster to be able to do stuff like that. So that's the basic idea, is using a crossfader module to blend together two different wave shapes instead of just a mixer, and then play with how you're driving the crossfade between those two wave shapes. Using a third oscillator, then detuning things from each other to get a lot of motion in them. For example, if I was to bring in the mother, which is going to be detuned yet again from these other oscillators. Maybe go to a higher octave on the mother. Or a lower octave. And that's a fun way to play with just combining oscillators together. And my bone to pick, I was joking with Joe about this last night, is so many oscillators are just doing the hard switch, as if it's just a square wave that's splicing them together. But to me, it really opens up the technique to be able to use any waveform to splice together the two donor waveforms by using a crossfader. Anyway, that was the idea. That's what I wanted to share.
And was that right? The module 2 to the left of the X fade, was that a wave shaper you were using as like a modulation source?
It's a wavetable oscillator. So it's a Erica Black wavetable oscillator.
Got it.
And so it's got a lot of different wavetables. I just happened to choose some vocal ones, but they've got other ones in here as well.
Yeah, that's really nice.
And I was just increasing the LFO rate. Slow for drones. Or fast modulation of the wave shape for the crossfade.
It's great. I love it.
Wow.
there's so much flexibility there, just manipulating basically, two VCAs just kind of crossing over each other with those signals. I mean, that's a lot of horsepower inside of one module with those modulation sources connected to it. It's really cool.
Yeah, I'm having a lot of fun with it to get more. I'm trying to get new waveforms and new sounds beyond just the basic square, saw, triangle sign that so many oscillators have. And this is one of the quicker and easiest ways to combine those wave shapes together to create some new harmonics and create a lot of motion. And I've been having a lot of fun.
Yeah, because normally for me to achieve something like that, I've got to stack multiple devices and then submix them and control all their envelopes separately. And you kind of remove a lot of those components and pack that feature into a small box. That's impressive. I see a whole lot more value to that crossfade now.
Yeah, there's a lot of patch cables just because I'm trying to run everything through the data so you can see what's going on. But what it really is it's just imagine replacing your oscillator mixer with a crossfader instead. That's what it comes down to. And you could use it just as a crossfade between, say, two waveforms, but when you start modulating the crossfade is when things start really opening up. You just simply envelope it or put an LFO into it, but when you put an oscillator into the crossfade, things start getting really rich then.